Recently, we've been looking back at some of the franchises who have graphics that are considered to be cutting edge today, and comparing them. Hey folks, it's Falcon, and today on GameRanks, the 10 best video game graphics then versus now, part 4. Number 10 is Halo 1 versus Halo 5. Now this isn't to say that Halo 1 is a bad looking game by any means, it's obviously not. It's that the style of art in Halo 1 is radically different from the style of art in even Halo 2, and that second style is the one that they've basically followed the path on. Halo 1 is a much more low polygon, rely on less detailed textures type of affair, whereas Halo 2 works to create smooth character models and use textures specifically to fill in a lot of detail. Over time, that style developed into what we've seen now, which is pretty high poly and with really great textures on the models. Halo 5 is really a gorgeous looking game. Environmentally, they actually do look fairly similar, although the detail of environments in Halo 5, of course, is quite a bit better. The change in philosophy of character design, I think, really does a lot more defining of what Halo looks like, because Master Chief kind of is Halo. Number 9 is Monster Hunter PS2 versus Monster Hunter World. Now, we could make a lot of comparisons about the controls between these two games, and there's some pretty big differences, but graphics? Wow. When you compare these two entries to this franchise, it's kind of amazing how good it looked back then. Monster Hunter World is a good looking game, let's just be 100% clear, but for PS2, Monster Hunter was like really good looking. I mean, if you released it today, it would be considered retro throwback graphics, but all things considered, looking back at this game, I'm actually fairly surprised how good it looks. It looks like Monster Hunter, it's identifiably that. When I see it, I think, oh, Monster Hunter, which of course is something that your eyes sort of train themselves on the most recent entry, so that's interesting. Obviously, Monster Hunter World is a way better looking game. People have much more expressive faces in it, monsters are much more detailed, the land textures are vastly superior. But when you put these two side by side, it's not really as stark as some of the games that we've been doing in this series. Number 8, Civilization 1 versus Civilization 6. Now, Civilization 1 is, if you've ever seen the oldest city builders, it's what that looks like. It looks like Civilization if it was SNES SimCity. And a lot of people don't remember this because, Civilization looked way better pretty quick. Like, they moved from full top-down to isometric by their second game, and it didn't take them long to move into a much more detailed and pretty 2D and then 3D style. Now what's interesting is how much the new 3D style of Civilization 6, which by the way is a little bit different from 5 if you have been paying attention, is actually pretty similar. As similar as 3D and 2D graphics can be. Obviously, Civilization 6 is a little bit more colorful. You were not capable of a lot of colors on older PCs. But when I see either of them, I see a Civilization game, which is interesting just because there's actually a really large amount of detail now. For the most part, I'm gonna say I prefer Civilization 6's graphics to Civilization 1's, just because visually speaking, certain things stick out just better. But there is also an element of nostalgia for the old style that with games that change radically over time. But in the case of this series, it's the same, but so different. And that makes it a bit easier to get wistful. Next, at number 7, we have Soul Edge / Soul Blade versus Soul Calibur 6. Now, at first we wanted to go with Soul Calibur 1, but you know what? We decided to go way back to where it first started. Kinda looked like basically every fighting game at the time. It certainly had a bit of a medieval flair to it, but you basically had the same kinds of arenas that you saw in Tekken. You just didn't have the Chinese theme. Not that it was a bad looking game, it just really didn't have an identity that stood out. Now, you could certainly say that technically speaking, it was a very good looking game for the time, but when you compare it to Soul Calibur 6, you have the decades of experience sort of bringing more of an identity to the game. It looks like Soul Calibur. Soul Calibur 6, on the other hand, is just Soul Calibur to the 10th power. The environments, the characters, everything about it it has something distinct to it that it really didn't before. And I understand that may be kind of divisive criticism, but keep in mind, I was really into Soul Blade and Soul Calibur 1. I thought it was a pretty game, and I really liked the mechanics probably more than I liked a lot of other fighting games, but I think visually it came into its own as the series progressed. Number 6. Pokemon Red versus Pokemon Sword. Now, Pokemon Red is an original Game Boy title in Pokemon Sword, I mean, we can make some very clear distinctions. Pokemon Red, though it has a color in its name, is black and white. I mean, it's that weird green black and white that Game Boy was, but it was black and white. It's top down, it had very simple battle screens, environments didn't look very different from each other, and Pokemon Sword and Shield are basically a new school JRPG in their look, and holy crap does it look good. This is kind of the Pokemon game I feel like everybody has been waiting for the one where they finally make it 3D and just a Pokemon game. But make no mistake, the world looks huge. It looks expansive, pretty, varied, and I can't wait to play it. Graphically, it's just, there's no comparison. We're talking about a Game Boy game and a Switch game. They're both technically handheld games, but it's apples and oranges, and probably the most extreme example possible. Number 5. Street Fighter vs. Street Fighter V. Now, there have been obviously a lot more Street Fighter games than that in between Street Fighter and 5. There's not 5 Street Fighter games. But the difference between here is pretty stark as well. The original Street Fighter was not a great looking game. For the time, it wasn't a bad looking game. It certainly utilized color palettes well, all things considered, but Street Fighter 2 was kind of when Street Fighter really came into its own, graphically speaking. So keeping that in mind, the slightly more limited palettes of Street Fighter 1 aren't really massively distinct. In the arcade, sure, it was a pretty cool looking game, but it definitely wasn't even Street Fighter at its Street Fighter-iest. 2D Street Fighter developed way beyond the original, of course. I mean, it's a game from 1987. But 3D Street Fighter came along, and by the time we got to Street Fighter V, we're talking about probably some of the best cartoonish graphics that exist. The way Street Fighter has updated its style without losing its style into this very distinct 3D graphic style they have that is very rooted in what this game has always looked like, particularly since Street Fighter 2 and Street Fighter 3 Alpha. Street Fighter 3's polygonal models aren't the most detailed you'll ever see in your life. They don't have the best textures you'll ever see in your life, but they have a style to them that utilizes everything very deliberately, and honestly, it's some of the best graphics in this kind of game, as far as this kind of style goes. Number 4. Far Cry vs. Far Cry 5. Now, Far Cry is a 2004 game. It was developed by Crytek and really stands out for 2004. The graphics in Far Cry are actually way above par as far as I'm concerned. It has pretty darn good texture work, has a lot of varied meshes, and I would just say it is generally just way above average for what it is. And, well, I would say that Far Cry 5 is a beautiful game. Some of the foliage and the texture work is really amazing. Is it the kind of standout that the original Far Cry was? No. There are a lot of games that look really good now, and Far Cry actually manages to have some repetitive textures in some areas. The path texture, for instance, I think can look a little repetitive from even a short distance. I mean, I don't want to say that it's bad or like the original looks better, but relative to what we expect out of games nowadays, I would say the original was a much bigger stunner. Number 3, FIFA International Soccer versus FIFA 19. Now, the original FIFA game came to both PC and other consoles, namely Sega Genesis. And on the PC, it obviously looked better with a better palette. And I'd even make the argument that the original isometric viewpoint that FIFA Soccer played in looked better than its initial tries with 3D games. Even FIFA Soccer 64 didn't really look very good. It was more just cool that you could play it in 3D, but really there was actually a weirdly large amount of personality in the isometric FIFA Soccer games, and their art style. Now, that's basically not really comparable to FIFA 20, which is this absolutely gorgeous looking, very realistic looking Frostbite powered game that frankly should be lauded for just how much it really does look like a TV broadcast of an international football game. Number 2, NBA 2K 1999 versus NBA 2K 2019. So NBA 2K 1999 is actually awesome looking. It's of course very retro looking now, but when you consider what FIFA looked like right next to the Sega Dreamcast's brand new, shiny, pretty realistic for the time looking game, it's pretty stark. Like during the 1990s, basketball games kind of had the problem of either being NBA Jam or being not NBA Jam. NBA Jam had a distinct look to it and everything else kind of blended together. having a pretty realistic looking NBA 2K in 1999 is pretty impressive. However, in 2019, NBA 2K obviously looks hundreds of times better. It is a realistic looking game as far as that goes. It's still pushing the limits. And that's pretty impressive after this amount of time. And finally, number 1 is Rainbow Six versus Rainbow Six Siege. Now, Rainbow Six kind of had a disadvantage because GoldenEye had basically defined what people wanted out of these games, first-person shooters, at least at that point. Rainbow Six is a very different game, but looks pretty similar actually. And considering GoldenEye was a couple years older, Rainbow Six really didn't have a lot going for it, graphically speaking. Some people thought it looked good, but I'd argue it definitely didn't look as good as it could have at the time. There were better looking games. I do remember thinking it was cool, but maybe more because of the gameplay style than the graphics. Like I said, the graphics of kind of a lot of other games at the time sort of overtook it a bit. And obviously we shouldn't say that Rainbow Six Siege is the best looking game you've ever seen. It's certainly better looking, has pretty good lighting effects, very good texture work, great meshes. It's a good looking game, and it's a massive jump over the original Rainbow Six. As far as that goes, I really can't wait to see how Rainbow Six looks on the next generation, because you know they'll have to do a big graphical update because they've basically been running it as a games as a service type game. They've been talking about how they're still against a sequel, which is interesting. Not even talking about the graphics right now, just it's a good game. What are some games that have changed in graphics over the years that you enjoy? Leave us a comment, let us know what you think, and if you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. The best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription. So click subscribe and don't forget to click the notification bell. As always, thank you very much for watching this. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter at Falcon the Hero, and we'll see you next time right here on Game Ranks.